The cold CEO Millionaire forced a contract on the poor girl. Her signature cracked his empire's facade. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. Alexander Reed was known for two things in Manhattan's glass and steel skyline: results and silence. At 38, he ran Reed Dominion with the kind of precision that made investors sleep well and employees measure their words. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When Alexander entered a room, conversations shortened, shoulders straightened, and decisions accelerated. He believed warmth diluted authority, that hesitation invited chaos, and that contracts, clean and absolute, were the only honest language between adults. On a gray morning that smelled faintly of rain and espresso, he sat at the long walnut table on the 42nd floor, sleeves tailored to the quarter-inch, a pen aligned perfectly with a thick document stamped with discreet gold. Across from him sat Emily Carter, hands folded tight enough to whiten her knuckles, shoes scuffed from miles of walking, posture upright not from confidence, but from resolve. The room hummed with the city below, a distant traffic heartbeat, as Alexander slid the contract forward with 2 fingers, stopping it exactly at the table's midpoint. He didn't look at her at first. He looked at the signature line, the thin blank space that could settle lawsuits, steady markets, and quiet rumors by nightfall. This agreement is simple, he said, voice even, American flat vowels polished by boardrooms. It provides stability. It ends speculation. It protects assets. He finally met her eyes, gray and unreadable. It solves your problem. Emily's problem was time measured in overdue notices and medical copays, in rent reminders and bus transfers counted to the dime. She had learned to calculate groceries by ounces and minutes by bus schedules. She had also learned that dignity could survive poverty if guarded fiercely. The document's pages whispered when she touched them, clauses stacked like steps too steep to climb without losing balance. There were rules, timelines, appearances, obligations. There were promises that read like numbers pretending to be mercy. The pen waited. Alexander believed the hook was efficiency, that urgency would close the distance between fear and consent. He had used it before, leveraged moments when the world narrowed and choices thinned. But as Emily read, something slowed the room. Her breathing steadied. Her eyes moved not like someone cornered, but like someone counting exits. She did not ask for more time. She asked one question, quiet and precise, the kind that slips past armor. If this is so simple, she said, why does it need my silence? The city's hum seemed to lean closer. Alexander answered without blinking. Because discretion preserves value. It was true, and it was incomplete. He had not prepared for the weight of her pause, for the way she set the pen down and then picked it up again, as if testing gravity. He had not prepared for the idea that a signature could do more than secure a deal. He had not prepared for the possibility that the smallest mark, ink pressed by a steady hand, could expose the thinness of a facade he had spent years perfecting. When Emily finally signed, it wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, a name written clean and legible, each letter a choice. The pen clicked shut. Alexander felt it then, a subtle shift, like a building settling after a long storm. He had won the moment. The contract lay complete. And yet something essential had moved, not in the market, not in the press, but in him, as if the empire he commanded had revealed a hairline crack, invisible to others, unmistakable to the one who built it, promising that the story he controlled was about to demand a different ending. The ink dried faster than Emily expected, as if the paper had been waiting for her name all along, and when Alexander gathered the pages with careful precision, the sound was final, a soft thud that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another neither of them had fully imagined. He stood first, not as a signal of dismissal, but as habit, pressing a button that summoned his assistant without a glance. Instructions were given in clipped, professional cadence, schedules rearranged, a driver assigned, keys prepared, all delivered as though Emily were another asset being on board, not a person whose world had just tilted. Emily rose more slowly, feeling the room recede behind her as the city beyond the windows resumed its indifference. Yellow cabs threading avenues, steam curling from grates, people counting minutes the way she counted dollars. The ride down 42 floors felt longer than the climb up had ever been. The elevator mirrors reflecting a woman who looked unchanged but felt newly weightless and unbearably heavy at once. Outside, the air carried a chill that cut through her jacket, and the car waiting at the curb gleamed like a promise that asked nothing in return except obedience. Alexander did not sit beside her. He sat across, knees aligned, hands folded, eyes on a tablet where numbers flickered and stabilized under his touch. Silence filled the space, not awkward, not warm, simply efficient. He broke it once, outlining the next 48 hours, fittings measured in inches, appearances timed to the minute, a residence prepared on the Upper East Side, within walking distance of Central Park, security protocols explained with the same care he applied to financial disclosures. Emily listened, memorizing the cadence more than the content, the way he said her name without emphasis, as if it were a variable he had just introduced. When the car stopped, the building rose pale and orderly, stone and glass arranged to reassure anyone who entered that nothing unexpected happened here. Inside, a doorman greeted Alexander by name and Emily by assumption, and that assumption stung more than she anticipated. The apartment was quiet and immaculate, sunlight tracing rectangles on hardwood floors, furniture placed to be admired rather than used. Alexander handed her a single key, metal cool against her palm, and explained boundaries with the same calm he used for clauses, rooms designated, routines clarified, the agreement made practical. She nodded, then surprised him by asking for one thing not listed. A chair by the window, she said, a place to sit in the morning. He paused, a fraction of a second, then agreed, as if granting a concession he did not fully understand. That night, alone in a bedroom larger than any space she had called her own, Emily unpacked the few belongings she had brought, setting them carefully on a dresser that reflected her movements back at her. She thought of the pen clicking shut, of the way Alexander had watched the page rather than her face, and she understood something essential about power, that it often looked away at the moment it believed it had won. Across the apartment, Alexander stood in his office, city lights painting his reflection onto the glass, contract secured in a locked drawer, mind returning to the question she had asked, the one he had answered truthfully but not completely. He told himself the unease was temporary, the echo of change, the cost of doing business at scale. Yet when he imagined the signature, it was not the ink he saw but the steadiness of her hand, the absence of panic, the quiet refusal to hurry. For the first time in years, a metric he trusted had failed to capture a variable that mattered, and as the city moved on beneath them, both understood without saying it that the agreement had bound more than their names, that it had set in motion a reckoning neither balance sheets nor schedules could delay. Morning arrived without ceremony, lights slipping between buildings and finding Emily exactly where she said she wanted to be, seated by the window with a mug she had filled herself, counting breaths as the city stretched awake. The apartment smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee, a neutral space learning her presence by degrees. She had slept little, not from fear but from adjustment, the quiet so complete it amplified her thoughts, every clause replaying until she forced herself to set them aside. At 8 sharp, the day began according to schedule, not because a bell rang, but because Alexander appeared, jacket on, movements efficient, eyes already ahead. He acknowledged the chair with a brief glance, then explained the rules again, not as a warning but as a system, mornings for preparation, afternoons for obligations, evenings unassigned unless specified, privacy respected so long as appearances were maintained. He did not raise his voice or soften it. He spoke as if clarity were kindness. A stylist arrived, then a tailor, measurements taken in inches, fabrics selected for durability and discretion, nothing extravagant, nothing revealing, choices framed as practicality rather than image. Emily answered questions plainly, correcting assumptions when needed, insisting on shoes she could walk a mile in without pain, on sleeves that allowed movement, on a coat warm enough for winter winds off the river. Alexander listened, occasionally interjecting with constraints that sounded like budgets but were really boundaries. At noon, A lunch was set that went mostly untouched, the food abundant and carefully arranged. Emily eating slowly, Alexander barely at all, already moving through calls that kept the market steady and the rumors quiet. He explained the first public appearance scheduled for the weekend, a benefit with donors who valued continuity and optics. Words like stability and partnership practiced until they sounded natural. Emily asked about introductions, about how to answer questions without lying outright. He paused, then adjusted, offering phrasing that balanced truth with omission, a skill he had perfected over years. As the afternoon wore on, the contract reasserted itself not on paper but in small frictions, the way staff waited for his cue before addressing her, the way decisions defaulted to his nod. Emily noticed and did not protest. Not yet, storing the observations like receipts she might need later. When the fittings ended, Alexander reviewed the schedule for the next week, tapping the tablet with a precision that suggested control was a comfort, not a habit. Emily asked another question, careful and direct, about work, about whether she could keep her shifts temporarily until matters resolved. The answer came measured, not dismissive, framed in optics and availability, and she accepted it with a nod that hid disappointment. Evening brought quiet again, and with it a moment neither had planned. A storm rolled in, rain tracing the windows, and the lights flickered just once before settling. Emily moved to the chair, watching water bead and race, while Alexander stood across the room, hands clasped behind his back, eyes on the city he believed he understood. He spoke then, not about schedules, but about expectations, about how this arrangement would function best if they avoided surprises. She agreed, then added that surprises were not always chosen. He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, not efficient now, but charged, and when he finally spoke, it was to acknowledge the point without conceding it. Later, alone, Emily laid out her clothes for the next day, folding carefully, placing the key on the dresser where she could see it, a reminder that access could be granted and revoked. Alexander returned to his office, opened the drawer, and checked the contract again, as if ensuring it had not altered itself overnight. He told himself progress required structure, that stability demanded limits. Yet as rain softened the city into reflection, both felt the first true test approaching, not in public, not in print, but in the quiet spaces where rules met resolve, and neither was prepared to yield. The wedding happened on a Thursday morning because Thursdays were efficient, because news cycles were lighter, because the city moved on without noticing small ceremonies tucked between meetings. Emily stood in a simple room that smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, a borrowed coat draped over her shoulders, the hem of her dress chosen for movement rather than spectacle. Alexander arrived exactly on time, suit pressed, expression composed, a witness on either side whose names Emily would forget even as they smiled politely. There was no aisle, only a few steps forward, no music beyond the hum of a building doing its work. The official spoke clearly, outlining commitments in plain language that echoed the contract without its clauses, and Emily listened for a feeling that might announce itself, some grand marker of change, but what came instead was steadiness, the same calm that had guided her hand when she signed. Alexander repeated the words without emphasis, voice level, eyes forward, as if promises were tasks to be completed correctly. Rings were exchanged, modest and unadorned, cool against skin, symbols chosen for discretion rather than shine. When it was done, the official smiled, pronounced them married, and moved on to the next appointment. Outside, the sky had cleared, sunlight reflecting off windows and windshields, and for a moment they stood on the steps unsure which direction to take, because the day had not been given instructions. Alexander suggested lunch, not celebratory but practical, a place nearby with booths and neutral menus. Emily agreed. They sat across from each other, the table between them suddenly charged with a new label that neither spoke aloud. He ordered coffee. She ordered soup. Conversation stayed within safe margins, schedules confirmed, logistics aligned, appearances discussed. A server congratulated them casually, and Alexander nodded while Emily thanked her, the word landing oddly, both heavier and lighter than expected. Back at the apartment, the staff adjusted without comment, titles updated in quiet systems, closets rearranged with care. Emily found the chair by the window moved slightly to catch the afternoon light, a small consideration that surprised her. Alexander retreated to calls that stretched into early evening, voice steady as markets responded, numbers aligning as expected. When he finally emerged, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, he paused in the doorway as if noticing the space anew. Emily was at the window again, watching joggers loop the park paths below, their breath visible in the cooling air. He asked if she needed anything. She said no, then corrected herself and asked for time, just a walk, an hour. He hesitated, then agreed, setting conditions that sounded like concern disguised as protocol. She returned before dark, cheeks flushed from the cold, steps measured, dignity intact. Dinner passed quietly, plates clinking, the city resuming its night rhythm beyond the glass. Later, the apartment settled, lights dimmed, and the reality of shared space asserted itself. Separate rooms had been agreed upon, and they honored that, doors closing with soft finality. In his room, Alexander removed the ring and set it on the nightstand, not out of rejection but habit, objects placed where they belonged. He stared at it longer than necessary, considering the precision of the day, how nothing had gone wrong, and yet something felt unresolved. In her room, Emily placed her ring beside the key, aligning them carefully, symbols of access and commitment resting side by side. She lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the building breathe, understanding that marriage, like contracts, could be entered cleanly and still demand more than compliance. Sleep came slowly to both, not troubled but alert, as if each sensed that the quiet ceremony had not closed a chapter but opened one, that the absence of spectacle had sharpened the truth, and that the real test would arrive not with cameras or crowds, but in the choices made when no one was watching. The first public event arrived with the predictability Alexander trusted and the uncertainty Emily felt in her bones. A benefit scheduled for Saturday evening at a downtown venue, where glass walls reflected the river and donors measured generosity in pledges announced with practiced ease. Preparations began early, not with nerves but with checklists, and Emily moved through them with the same steady attention she brought to everything else. Dress chosen for warmth and mobility, shoes tested for comfort over several city blocks, hairstyled simply to hold its shape under lights. Alexander reviewed talking points at the kitchen island, adjusting phrasing to sound personal without revealing anything personal at all, reminding her of names and relationships, which board member favored which initiative, which question to deflect with gratitude. They arrived together, a seamless entrance time to avoid crowds, cameras clicking politely, not hungrily, and the room seemed to lean toward them in recognition of the image they presented. Emily smiled when addressed, listened before answering, asked questions that drew others out, a skill learned from years of making herself small and attentive in larger rooms. Alexander watched from a step back, noticing how she navigated without prompting, how she redirected attention toward the cause rather than the spectacle, how her presence eased conversations that had stalled under formality. Midway through the evening, a moment tested them both. A donor approached with a concern delivered as a compliment, praising continuity while hinting at uncertainty, asking what this new partnership meant for governance and transparency. Alexander prepared to answer with the standard assurance, but Emily spoke first, not contradicting him, not overstepping, simply reframing, emphasizing stewardship and accountability in plain terms that sounded less like strategy and more like promise. The donor nodded, satisfied, and moved on. Alexander felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, the room responding not to authority, but to sincerity. Later, a minor complication arose, a scheduling confusion that threatened to delay a presentation, staff murmuring, glances darting. Emily stepped in calmly, clarifying with a coordinator, adjusting the order without drama, ensuring volunteers were acknowledged. The program continued, applause warm and sustained. On the drive home, silence settled again, different now, not efficient but reflective. Alexander broke it by acknowledging her choices, not praising, simply recognizing effectiveness. Emily accepted with a nod, then asked a question of her own, about the foundation's work beyond events, about impact measured outside reports. He answered more fully than intended, describing programs he rarely discussed, the reasons he had built them, the losses that had shaped his caution. At the apartment, shoes set aside, jackets hung, The night carried a quiet satisfaction neither named. In the days that followed, rumors softened into acceptance, headlines brief and unalarming, markets steady. Emily resumed her routine, adding obligations without surrendering herself to them, insisting on the chair by the window each morning, walking when weather allowed, learning the city not as a backdrop, but as a place where people lived between promises. Alexander adjusted schedules to accommodate realities he had previously ignored, discovering that control did not require constant presence. Then came the first misunderstanding, seeded not by malice but by assumption. A comment overheard, a phrase lifted without context, suggested that Emily's role had been calculated, that appearances were all that mattered. She did not confront him immediately. She watched instead, noted how decisions were made when she was not in the room, how credit was assigned, how silence could imply consent. When she finally spoke, it was measured, asking whether she was expected to remain an image or allowed to be a participant. Alexander answered defensively at first, citing agreements and optics, then stopped, recognizing the distance his words created. The contract, once a solution, now hovered between them like a line drawn too cleanly to cross. That night, Emily placed the ring back on her finger after having removed it to wash her hands, the simple act feeling heavier than before. Alexander returned to the drawer, opened it, and left it open, the papers visible under the light. Neither moved to change anything yet, but both understood that the success of the evening had exposed a deeper risk, that the arrangement worked too well on the surface to ignore the truth underneath, and that the next choice would not be about appearances at all. The days after the benefit settled into a careful rhythm that felt rehearsed even when it was not. Mornings beginning with the chair by the window and the city's measured pace. Afternoons divided between obligations and the quiet work Emily chose to keep. Evenings negotiated by glances rather than schedules. Alexander found himself watching for the moments she entered a room not as an accessory, but as a presence, noticing how conversations recalibrated when she asked questions that required more than a rehearsed answer. He did not comment on it, but he adjusted plans subtly, inviting her to briefings where her insight would not be expected, and then registering the surprise when it arrived anyway. Emily, for her part, learned the architecture of his days, the pressure points where markets tightened and softened, the habit of control he used to keep grief contained, and she navigated without pressing too hard, aware that trust moved at a pace set by fear as much as intention. One afternoon, a call ended with more tension than usual, Alexander's voice firm as he outlined a corrective strategy to a team that wanted certainty without accountability. When he set the phone down, Emily asked what the concern was, not prying, simply present. He answered with numbers at first, then stopped and spoke plainly about the risk of compromise disguised as convenience, about how quickly principles eroded when no one was watching. She listened and then said that people noticed when standards held, even quietly, and that trust was built not by statements, but by consistency. The words landed not as instruction, but as recognition. That evening, they walked, a route through the park that took longer than necessary, the air cool enough to sharpen focus, runners passing, dogs pulling leashes toward fallen leaves. Alexander mentioned a meeting scheduled for the next week, a closed-door session with advisors who preferred the old ways, and Emily asked if she should attend. He hesitated, weighing optics against outcomes, then said yes, not as a concession, but as a test he did not label as such. The meeting arrived, formal and restrained, the room arranged to reinforce hierarchy. Emily sat beside Alexander, hands folded, posture attentive. When concerns surfaced about transparency and leadership continuity, Alexander addressed them with precision, then paused and invited Emily to speak. She chose her words carefully, describing responsibility as something shared, not delegated, and commitment as something visible in daily choices rather than announcements. The room responded with thoughtful silence rather than resistance. Afterward, an advisor pulled Alexander aside and remarked on the clarity she brought, the steadiness that reassured without bluster. On the drive home, Alexander thanked her, then added that he had not anticipated how much he would rely on her judgment. Emily replied that reliance came with responsibility, and that responsibility came with voice. He nodded, accepting the equation. Later that night, the misunderstanding surfaced fully, not through confrontation but through accumulation. Emily learned of a draft statement prepared without her input, one that reduced her role to a line item, an image rather than a partner. She waited until morning, then brought it to Alexander, asking why it had been written that way. He defended the draft reflexively, citing tradition and caution, then stopped when he saw her expression, not angry but resolved. She said she would not be managed into silence, that she had agreed to terms but not to erasure. The word struck him, erasure, because it named the cost of efficiency he had refused to see. He apologized, not elaborately, but clearly, and asked her to help rewrite it. They did, side by side at the table, language shifting from containment to commitment. When it was done, Alexander set the tablet aside and looked at her, seeing not a variable but a standard he wanted to meet. The contract drawer remained open that night, papers visible but untouched, as if waiting for a decision not yet formed. Emily returned the chair to the window after moving it to catch the late light, a small act of claiming space that no one challenged. As the city quieted, both understood that the arrangement had crossed a threshold, that what began as control now required consent renewed daily, and that the true measure of the partnership would be how they responded when authority asked for comfort and conscience asked for courage. The night that changed the temperature between them did not announce itself with drama but arrived quietly after a long day, the city washed clean by a late rain that left the air sharp and honest. Emily finished rinsing a mug and set it upside down to dry, the small domestic ritual grounding her, while Alexander stood at the counter staring at the reflection of lights trembling across the darkened glass. He had canceled the last call of the evening, something he rarely did, and the absence of urgency felt strange, like standing still after a moving walkway ended. He spoke without turning, saying that there were things about the company he had never explained, not because they were confidential, but because they were personal, and that the line between the two had always felt safer drawn thick. Emily listened without interrupting, leaning against the chair by the window, hands relaxed, posture open but not expectant. Alexander described the early years, the scramble for capital, the promises made and broken, the lesson learned when trust cost him more than money ever could. He spoke of a partner who had smiled through meetings and siphoned resources quietly, of headlines that praised resilience while ignoring the sleepless months that followed, of the moment he decided warmth was a liability. His voice did not waver, but his pace slowed, sentences lengthening as if searching for air. Emily asked one question, whether he had ever allowed himself to be wrong without punishing the mistake. The question landed gently and still struck deep. He admitted that he did not know how to do that, that control had become a way to keep grief contained, that efficiency had shielded him from the risk of caring too much. The admission surprised him as much as it surprised her. Silence followed, not heavy but attentive, the kind that allows truth to finish speaking. Emily shared her own calculus, the years of counting every expense, the way dignity became something she defended daily, how silence could be a strategy until it became a surrender. She said that agreements mattered, but so did the space to change, that signatures captured moments, but not people. Alexander nodded, understanding the distinction with a clarity that unsettled him. He reached for the drawer, then stopped, leaving it closed, as if acknowledging that some gestures could not be reversed casually. Instead, he asked what she wanted from this, not in the abstract but now. Emily answered plainly, saying she wanted voice without penalty, presence without performance, and the freedom to choose honesty even when it complicated plans. He agreed, not as a clause but as a commitment, saying that he would listen before deciding, that he would share information rather than manage perceptions, that he would accept disagreement as part of partnership rather than a threat to it. The words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, and right all the same. Later, they sat by the window together, not touching, watching the city resume its nocturnal rhythms, a bus signed to a stop, a cyclist threading traffic, lights switching from red to green in patient sequence. Alexander mentioned the ring then, that he removed it out of habit, not intent, and Emily said she noticed, not with judgment but awareness. She told him she put it back on after washing her hands because choices mattered even in small acts. He smiled faintly, the expression tentative and real, and said he would try to remember that. When they finally separated for the night, doors closing softly, the apartment felt different, less staged, more lived in. Alexander lay awake longer than usual, replaying the conversation not as risk but as relief, recognizing that the empire he guarded so fiercely might be strongest where it allowed light in. Emily set the ring and the key side by side again, then moved the chair a few inches to catch the moonlight, an adjustment that felt symbolic without trying to be. Sleep came with ease. Neither expected, and in the quiet hours before morning, both sensed that the arrangement had shifted from something enforced to something chosen, fragile and promising in equal measure, ready to be tested by the daylight that always asked for proof. The shift began subtly, as these things often did, with a question that sounded like concern and a smile that lingered half a second too long. At a midweek meeting, an advisor Alexander trusted raised an eyebrow and asked how decision authority was being shared now, phrasing it as a governance clarification while eyes flicked toward Emily and then away. Alexander answered calmly, outlining process and accountability, but the seed had been planted, and Emily felt it take root in the room's quiet recalibration. Over the next days, whispers traveled faster than memos, speculation dressed as prudence, old alliances testing the boundaries of the new arrangement. A draft agenda circulated that excluded Emily from a session she had helped shape, and when she asked why, the reply cited efficiency. Efficiency, she noticed, was often the first refuge of fear. Alexander sensed the resistance hardening, the way certain voices grew louder while others fell silent, and he recognized the pattern from years past, when change threatened comfort, and comfort defended itself with tradition. He scheduled a closed-door review, determined to cut through the noise, but before it could happen, an article appeared online, measured in tone yet sharp in implication, praising stability while questioning the authenticity of partnerships built too quickly. Emily read it once, then again, noting how carefully it avoided falsehood while implying motive, how her name appeared adjacent to words like optics and leverage. She did not bring it to Alexander immediately. Instead, she watched how the building responded, which doors opened without pause and which required additional knocks. When they finally spoke that evening, the city glowing beyond the glass, Alexander apologized for the delay, explaining the legal calculus behind responding publicly, the need to avoid amplifying speculation. Emily listened, then said she understood the strategy but needed to know whether silence would cost her more than speech. The question was not about headlines. It was about standing in rooms where decisions were made and being seen as more than a signal. Alexander assured her that he would address it, that he would not allow insinuation to harden into policy. The review convened the next morning. Faces familiar and wary, the air dense with unspoken stakes. Alexander opened by reaffirming standards and outlining recent outcomes that spoke for themselves. Then he invited Emily to speak, not as an accessory, but as a contributor. She chose not to defend herself directly. Instead, she described the work in progress, the measures taken to increase transparency, the way trust compounded when commitments were honored consistently. Her voice was steady, unembellished, and the room responded with attentive silence. Afterward, a dissenting voice questioned whether her influence had been engineered to soften scrutiny, a challenge framed as caution. Emily answered without flinching, stating that scrutiny was welcome and that influence earned through work could withstand it. Alexander supported her plainly, naming the value she brought and the results achieved, refusing to hedge. The meeting ended without resolution, but the lines were clear now. That afternoon, an internal memo circulated, anonymous but pointed, suggesting that the partnership risked diluting authority. Emily read it at the chair by the window, the city moving on outside, and felt the old instinct to retreat press against her resolve. She went to Alexander's office and placed the memo on his desk, saying that she would not be positioned as a liability to be managed. If the arrangement required her to absorb doubt without voice, she would reconsider her place in it. Alexander did not argue. He read the memo carefully, then folded it once and set it aside. He said he would address the source and the sentiment, not with retaliation but with clarity, and asked her to stay present while he did. She agreed, not as a concession but as a choice, understanding that change demanded endurance as well as courage. The response came the following day, a firm statement of principles and process, names attached, accountability specified. Some welcomed it. Others bristled. The cost of daylight revealed itself in small frictions and delayed approvals, but it also drew new allies who valued consistency over comfort. That night, as they walked the familiar park loop, Alexander admitted that the resistance unsettled him less than he expected, that the fear he had carried for years was losing its grip. Emily said fear did not vanish. It learned new rules. They stopped at the railing, watching the river carry reflections downstream, and understood together that the challenge had shifted from managing appearances to choosing integrity in full view, that the contract no longer defined the risk, and that whatever came next would test not their image but their resolve. The rupture did not arrive with raised voices or slammed doors, but with timing that refused to align, moments slipping past each other until intent was misread as avoidance. It began with a meeting rescheduled twice, then moved again without Emily's knowledge, an unavoidable conflict cited after the fact. She told herself it was logistics, yet the pattern tugged at old instincts that had learned to read absence as message. Alexander was pulled into crisis management that week, a cascade of approvals delayed by resistance now emboldened to test boundaries, and he assumed Emily knew the pressure he was under because he had shared so much recently. He assumed wrong. When she learned of a private call with advisors that excluded her, the explanation arrived clipped and procedural, phrased like a shield. She nodded and said nothing, choosing not to escalate, choosing patience. But patience felt different when it began to resemble erasure. An internal draft surfaced again, revised this time, smoother and more careful, still positioning her influence as symbolic rather than substantive. Emily read it late, the apartment quiet, the city humming below, and the old weight returned, the familiar calculus of whether to speak and be labeled difficult or remain silent and be diminished. She left the paper on the table and went for a walk, the park damp with recent rain, lights streaking the paths, thinking about how quickly progress could be recast as convenience. Alexander noticed the paper when he returned, read it with a tightening jaw, and told himself it was a temporary concession to move negotiations forward, a bridge that would be dismantled later. He did not realize that bridges built without consent collapsed under their own logic. When Emily returned, she asked him directly whether the strategy required her to step back publicly. He answered with nuance instead of clarity, explaining phases and optics, the need to stabilize before expanding roles. The words sounded reasonable, and that was the problem. She heard a future postponed indefinitely, a promise deferred until it no longer mattered. She said she would not be staged into invisibility, that she had agreed to partnership, not to patience without voice. Alexander replied that he was protecting the work, protecting them, and the pronoun landed poorly. Protection, without permission, sounded like control dressed as care. The air shifted. Emily said she needed space, not as threat, but as boundary, and asked whether the arrangement allowed for that. Alexander hesitated, searching for the clause that governed distance, then said yes, of course, unaware that the hesitation answered more than the words. That night, she moved the chair back from the window and packed a small bag. Not leaving entirely but creating distance within the same city. A friend's spare room offered without questions. Alexander watched from the doorway, wanting to argue and not knowing how to do so without reducing her choice to an inconvenience. He let her go, telling himself it was temporary, that clarity required time. The days that followed stretched thin. Headlines speculated gently. Advisors pressed harder. Alexander defended principles publicly while compromising privately, the contradiction wearing him down. Emily attended fewer events, declined appearances, focused on work that did not require endorsement, her absence noticed and interpreted in ways she could not control. When they spoke, conversations stayed careful, polite, circling the core without touching it. One afternoon, Alexander received a note from an advisor congratulating him on restoring order, praising decisive leadership. He read it twice and felt no satisfaction. That evening, Emily returned to the apartment to collect mail, finding the contract drawer open again, papers neatly aligned. She did not touch them. Instead, she placed her ring beside the key and left them there, a quiet statement of terms unmet. Alexander came home later and saw the objects resting together, understood the message immediately, and felt the consequence of choosing strategy over trust. He called her, then stopped. realizing that explanations would sound like excuses unless he was willing to change course. The misunderstanding had hardened into distance not because either lacked care, but because both had chosen caution at the wrong moment. As night settled, the city indifferent and persistent, each sat alone with the same question framed differently, whether partnership could survive when tested by fear, and whether the courage to choose differently would arrive in time. The truth surfaced not as a confession but as a convergence, facts aligning until the shape could no longer be ignored. Alexander spent the morning with counsel reviewing timelines, memos, and the quiet pressure applied by interests that preferred leverage to sunlight. Patterns emerged where he had once seen isolated cautions, and the realization settled with a clarity that felt like relief and indictment at once. The contract had not been born only of control or caution. It had been a bulwark erected under siege. Months earlier, a hostile maneuver had threatened to fracture governance through technicalities, a campaign designed to trigger instability by exploiting rumors and succession ambiguity. Advisors had urged a swift, stabilizing symbol, something that would lock perception into continuity long enough to neutralize the attack. Marriage, framed as partnership, had been presented as the cleanest line through the noise. Alexander had agreed, believing decisiveness would protect what he had built and the programs that depended on it. He had told himself that necessity absolved method. Now he understood the cost of that reasoning. He asked for the full file and read until the afternoon light thinned, noting how often Emily's presence had steadied rooms he could not, how the very thing intended as optics had become substance. When Emily agreed to meet, they chose a quiet place near the river, a bench with an unobstructed view where passing traffic dissolved into sound. Alexander did not lead with apology or defense. He laid out the chronology plainly, the attempted takeover, the legal traps, the urgency that narrowed his choices, the advisors who framed speed as virtue. He admitted that he had believed control would minimize harm, that he had underestimated the harm of control itself. Emily listened, eyes on the water, absorbing the scope without interrupting. When he finished, he said the words he had avoided before, that the contract had been a shield for the company and a failure of courage toward her, that he had chosen certainty over consent and paid for it in trust. Emily asked whether the threat remained. He answered honestly, saying it had been neutralized, not by the symbol, but by sustained transparency and the alliances that formed when integrity held. She asked why he had not told her sooner. He replied that fear had taught him to compress truth into tactics, and that he was unlearning the habit. The answer did not erase the hurt, but it aligned the story. Emily said she needed to know whether he would choose differently now, not in theory but in practice, whether he would accept vulnerability as a strategy rather than a risk. Alexander reached into his coat and placed a folded document on the bench between them, not dramatic, simply present. It was a statement prepared for the board and the public, outlining governance reforms, naming shared authority explicitly, and committing to transparency measures that would remove the incentive for manipulation. At the bottom, there was space for signatures, his and hers, not as optics, but as accountability. He said he would release it regardless of her decision, that the company would be stronger for it, and that he would accept whatever choice she made without negotiation. Emily read carefully, the river moving steadily, as if keeping time. She said she would not be leveraged again, that partnership required choice renewed daily, not secured by paper alone. Alexander agreed. He said he wanted to rebuild without shortcuts, that he was prepared to relinquish control where it impeded trust, that the empire he guarded mattered less than the people it affected. The words were not polished, but they were complete. Emily stood, feeling the weight of the moment not as pressure, but as possibility. She did not sign then. She said she would return when she was ready, and that readiness would be measured by action, not persuasion. Alexander nodded, understanding that the reveal did not end the conflict. It clarified the stakes. As they parted, the river carried reflections downstream, and the city continued its work, indifferent to reckonings that mattered anyway. Alexander walked back with a lighter step than he expected, knowing that the facade he had built had cracked not to expose weakness but to admit light, and that the next choice would determine whether the opening became a doorway or a fault line. The days that followed tested resolve in ways quieter than confrontation and heavier than headlines. the kind of waiting that demanded proof rather than promises. Alexander released the governance statement as he had said he would, attaching his name without conditions, outlining authority shared and processes exposed to daylight. The response was immediate and uneven, some applauding clarity, others warning of risk, markets flickering before settling. He accepted the turbulence, declining to soften language, declining to delay. In the apartment, the contract drawer remained untouched, papers still aligned, a reminder of what had been and what no longer governed his choices. Emily watched from a distance at first, reading reactions, noting which voices leaned into fear and which leaned into principle. She returned to the chair by the window one morning, sunlight catching the edge of the table, and felt the steadiness that told her she was ready to decide not out of urgency, but alignment. She requested a meeting with the board, not as an appeal but as a statement of presence, and when the invitation arrived, it came with the careful phrasing of those who understood stakes had shifted. The room was familiar now, faces composed, postures guarded. Alexander opened with a brief acknowledgement and then stepped back, visibly and intentionally, placing the floor in Emily's hands. She spoke without notes, outlining her conditions plainly, that partnership required voice without penalty, that transparency was not a concession but a foundation, that authority gained meaning only when shared responsibly. She said she would not be framed as insurance against instability, nor would she accept patience as a substitute for participation. If the company wanted continuity, it would earn it through consistency. Questions followed, sharp and measured, and she answered each with clarity, refusing bait and acknowledging limits without retreat. When the session ended, there was no applause, only a nodding acceptance that felt more durable. Outside, the city moved as it always did, and Emily felt the familiar mix of relief and gravity that accompanied a choice made cleanly. She returned to the apartment that evening and found Alexander waiting, not with explanations, but with space. He asked one question, whether she was choosing the partnership or choosing herself. She answered that she was choosing both, and that one did not survive without the other. He nodded, understanding that this was not a negotiation but a boundary honored. Together, they went to the drawer. Alexander removed the contract and set it on the table between them. Emily placed her ring beside it, then moved it away, leaving the paper alone. Alexander tore the document once, precisely, not in anger but finality, and placed the pieces into an envelope without ceremony. He said that if they were to continue, it would be without scaffolding, that commitments would be spoken and kept, not enforced. Emily agreed, adding that accountability would be mutual, that trust would be measured daily. They sealed the envelope and set it aside, an artifact rather than a rule. The weeks that followed brought work, real work, committees reformed, processes tested, a public forum where questions were taken without deflection. Emily stood beside Alexander, not as symbol but as participant, correcting gently, amplifying others, modeling the transparency she had demanded. Alexander learned to pause before deciding, to ask before assuming, to accept dissent without defense. Their private moments remained quiet and careful, walks through the park, shared meals, conversations that ended without conclusions because they did not need them. When an advisor remarked that the company felt different, more resilient, Alexander replied that resilience was not built by control, but by consent. Emily heard and smiled, knowing that words mattered when they followed action. One evening, as the city lights softened and the apartment settled into a rhythm that felt earned, Alexander asked if she would consider a future not defined by repair, but by intention. Emily said she would, with the understanding that intention required renewal. They did not mark the moment with ceremony. They placed the envelope containing the torn contract in a box and set it on a shelf, not hidden, not displayed, a reminder of a choice made and a standard set. Outside, the river carried reflections downstream, and inside, two people chose a partnership grounded not in force or fear, but in the courage to stand fully seen, ready for whatever daylight asked next. The proposal did not arrive with a crowd or a spotlight, but with intention refined by patience, the kind that had learned to speak softly because it trusted being heard. It was a clear Saturday morning when Alexander asked Emily to walk with him along the river, the air bright and cool, the paths busy with ordinary life that no longer felt distant. He chose the bench where they had spoken truth weeks earlier, the water moving steadily, as if keeping promises to itself. They sat, not rushing, sharing silence that had become comfortable, and Alexander began by acknowledging the work between them, the reforms that had taken root, the meetings where disagreement sharpened decisions rather than stalling them, the way the company had stabilized without sacrificing openness. He said that the empire he once guarded like a fortress now felt more like a city, resilient because it welcomed accountability. Emily listened, eyes on the water, recognizing the man who had learned to name change without fear. Alexander took out a small box, not ornate, and set it between them unopened. He said he was not asking to repair anything. That repair had already happened through choices made daily. He said he was asking to build forward, to choose each other without clauses or deadlines, to accept that partnership was not secured by paper but renewed by action. He acknowledged the past plainly, that he had once forced certainty where consent belonged, and that the lesson had changed him. Emily looked at the box and then at him, measuring not the gesture but the consistency behind it. She said she would answer honestly, that honesty had been their most reliable compass. She spoke of dignity preserved through choice, of voice honored through practice, of love that did not demand erasure or patience as payment. She said she would not accept a proposal framed as safety or stability, but she would accept one framed as responsibility shared. Alexander nodded and opened the box, revealing a simple ring, unadorned, chosen for durability and comfort, something that could be worn daily without announcement. He said he chose it because it would not compete with her life, only accompany it. Emily smiled, the expression easy and unguarded, and said yes, not as surrender but as affirmation, not because the future promised ease but because it promised honesty. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and the moment settled without spectacle, witnessed by the river and the passing day. They stood and walked, the city unfolding around them, and Emily felt the familiar steadiness that came from alignment rather than relief. In the weeks that followed, they marked the commitment not with headlines, but with habits, shared calendars that reflected shared priorities, decisions made in rooms where dissent was welcomed, evenings that ended with conversations unfinished because they could continue tomorrow. The envelope containing the torn contract remained on the shelf, visible and inert, a reminder of what they had refused to repeat. When colleagues noticed the ring, congratulations were offered without qualifiers, and when questions arose, answers were given plainly. The wedding they planned was modest by design, a gathering that honored presence over performance, vows spoken in words chosen together, promises that acknowledged imperfection and pledged repair without coercion. On the morning of the ceremony, Emily returned the chair by the window to its place and sat for a moment, breathing in the city that had taught her resilience. Alexander joined her, and they shared a quiet laugh at how far they had come not by avoiding conflict, but by choosing courage. As they left for the ceremony, the river caught the light and carried it forward, and the path ahead felt neither guaranteed nor daunting, simply open, defined by consent, sustained by integrity, and ready to be lived. The life they built after the ceremony did not feel like an ending so much as a practice, a daily choosing shaped by habits that honored what they had learned. Morning light still found the chair by the window, and Emily still sat there with coffee she brewed herself, the city waking in layers, buses sighing, storefronts lifting gates, the river keeping time. Alexander joined her when he could, sometimes with headlines to discuss, sometimes with nothing at all, learning that presence did not require agenda. At work, the reforms held, not because they were perfect, but because they were maintained, committees rotating leadership, disclosures routine rather than reactive, decisions documented with reasons that invited scrutiny. When challenges arose, as they always did, the response was measured and public, not managed into silence. Emily chaired sessions where voices once excluded found room, and she insisted on plain language, on outcomes explained in terms that made sense beyond boardrooms. Alexander supported without overshadowing, correcting when needed and accepting correction without defensiveness, discovering that authority strengthened when it listened. Their home reflected the same ethic, shared calendars updated together, disagreements handled before they hardened, laughter returning easily after tension because repair was practiced, not postponed. The envelope with the torn contract remained on the shelf, a quiet artifact that visitors noticed only if they looked closely. When asked, Emily would say it marked a lesson, not a wound, and Alexander would add that it marked a choice he intended to keep choosing. They marked milestones modestly, a dinner after a successful quarter, a walk after a difficult meeting, celebrating effort as much as result. The city continued to test them with speed and pressure, but they moved through it aligned, aware that alignment did not mean agreement at all times, only a commitment to truth. One evening, as autumn settled and leaves gathered along the park paths, they attended a community forum together, not as hosts but as participants, listening to concerns that did not flatter and suggestions that did not simplify. Emily spoke last, summarizing without claiming credit, and Alexander followed by committing resources without conditions. Applause was brief and genuine. On the way home, they walked in comfortable silence, the river reflecting lights like scattered coins, and Alexander said that the empire no longer felt like something he owned, but something he stewarded. Emily replied that stewardship required humility and endurance, and he smiled, recognizing the standard she had set and kept. Later, in the apartment, they placed the ring box in a drawer not hidden, not prominent, because the ring lived on her hand, not in presentation. They talked about the future without scripting it, acknowledging risks without surrendering to them, planning a trip that would require time off and trusting the systems they had built to hold. When a reporter asked how the transformation had happened, Alexander answered simply that it began when he learned to listen and continued when he learned to share. Emily added that dignity was not granted by status, but sustained by choice. The city heard and moved on, as cities do, but the words settled where they mattered. On a clear morning months later, Emily returned the chair by the window after cleaning and sat, breathing in the steady calm that had replaced vigilance. Alexander joined her, placing his hand over hers, not possessive, just present. They watched the city wake and understood that what they had built would require care every day, that love without control demanded courage, and that leadership without fear demanded humility. Outside, the river carried reflections forward, and inside, two people chose again, quietly and fully, a partnership grounded in consent and integrity, resilient enough to face whatever daylight asked next.